молодой. Нужно сделать все, чтобы олимпийский огонь не погас.
Hello and welcome to Konstantinovsk 80, a Cities Skylines series that will explore an alternative history to one particular region of the Soviet Union. Over the coming months, years, however long it takes, we'll be building up the city and talking a little bit about the real history of the region, as well as our alternate history that we'll be building up as we go. Now, back in 2008, I had to go to Russia for a thing, specifically to Kaliningrad, which is this little exclave here. It sits on the Baltic Sea and it's sandwiched between Lithuania and Poland, separated from mainland Russia by Lithuania and Belarus. It used to be the Prussian city of Königsberg until World War II, when it was completely leveled, and after the Potsdam Conference came under the administration of the Soviets. Ever since my visit there 12 years ago, it's been a place that's stuck in the back of my mind, and since I started playing Cities Skylines, I've made 2 or 3 half-decent attempts at recreating it in the game. There are already a couple of decent maps for the region on the Steam Workshop, but they didn't quite pass the sort of feels right test for me. They were all just a little bit too small in scale and didn't quite capture the big wide open spaces of the city of Kaliningrad. So for that reason, I'm going to be starting this series completely from scratch with a brand new map for the region. And if you want to get straight to that, you can skip ahead now to around the 5-minute mark. And if you want to skip over the map creation altogether, you can go to around about 9.5 minutes, where we start actually laying down some proper roads. But for now, I want to talk a little bit about the era that we're setting our series in, the year 1980. Of course, this was the year of the Moscow Olympics, and we could probably have a bit of fun with that at some point in our alternate timeline. Another reason is that most of the Soviet-themed assets on the Steam Workshop are from around this sort of era or before. There's very little from after that particular time period. But another main reason I wanted to set it in 1980 is this documentary I found on Kaliningrad from that year. You can find a link to this documentary in the description of the video. It's a really charming little piece of film, and for me it was very instructive in terms of what feeling I should be aiming to capture with this series.
Калининград. Самый западный областной центр Российской Федерации.
The mission statement for the building of Kaliningrad was a garden city, and I think these scenes from 1980 show just that. These beautiful wide open spaces, well maintained, completely lush with greenery. They stand in quite stark contrast to my memories of the place from 2008, which was sadly pretty neglected since Soviet times, though I do hear more recently things are starting to look up again. It's also good to get a close-up look at some of the public transport that was going around in Kaliningrad in 1980, as of course there will be a very heavy focus on public transport infrastructure in our series, as there was in the former Soviet Union. This film also gave me a few good stylistic ideas for how to present this series, such as, well, these title cards, which you'll see a lot of throughout each episode. And I'll be using this video as a sort of cross-reference with Google Earth, just to make sure I'm not plopping down buildings that weren't there at the time or don't really work with the time period. But we can probably worry about all that a little bit later on, because for now, we've got a map to make. So, as you can see here, I've imported a 15 square kilometer map from Terrain Party into the game. Not the usual 18 square kilometers. I did it 15 square kilometers to blow it up to a slightly larger scale than I was talking about before in order to sort of capture that sense of space. And I didn't use a height map, I used the actual road map. And that's obviously so I could have a template to put the main road and rail systems on and save myself a bit of headache later on. But as you can see, it's pretty janky and the terrain is pretty much all over the place. It's going to be pretty difficult to get all of this leveled out, especially when you're really trying hard not to lose all of the fine details that are on this map, like the divots in the harbour and all the floodplains there. But really, the hardest part is finding a good place to start. And once you make a start, well, so there we have our map with all the major roadways, waterways, and railways included. There's still a few bits of terrain here and there that can be tidied up as we go, sort of jaggedy edges, especially around the waterways. But in game, rather than in the map editor, it's a lot easier because in the map editor, you're limited to how detailed you can get with the terrain brush, whereas with all the mods in game, you can get very, very down into the fine detail. All that being said, I was fairly happy with how this map turned out in the end, happy enough at least to be able to put it on the Steam Workshop. So we've set this project up pretty well for the future. Now we just have to stop the vanilla cars and trucks from spawning, and then we can get started on the central square. First things first, we need to upgrade some of these highway pieces into 6-lane wide tram roads. Now in any old postcard pictures of Kaliningrad, you'll see these gorgeous old Tatra T3 trams featured quite prominently. So we need to lay down some infrastructure ready for them when we get around to adding public transport in later on. One thing you'll run into when you're doing small segments of tram roads at intersections is that the catenaries will start to bunch up. So, using Network Skins 2, I've removed the catenaries, and it's time to do some wire work. Kaliningrad, these big arterial roads ran trolleybuses as well as the trams, and they still do to this day. And as it goes in Kaliningrad, so it goes in our alternate history Konstantinovsk. There's not many combined tram trolleybus main roads on the workshop, so we might have to come back to this wire work at a later date. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Taking just a cursory look at some of the buildings that surround the central square here, but we're not quite done with roadworks yet. In particular, I want to have a look at this little junction at the north end of the central square. Let's have a closer look. Okay, fairly simple. 6-lane road with a cobblestone tramway going up through the middle. Should be pretty simple. Let's see if we can do this the hard way though. Now this little clip doesn't do them justice, but these concrete highways by Clues are just the most perfect roads, and they're very handy for getting rid of pesky curbs as well. You'll see a lot more of them as the series goes on. And what you just saw me do was use a clipping network to hide that bit of terrain that was coming up through the road. It's a neat little trick when you're working with really small intersections like this. Being careful not to rough up this road too much, it would have been well worn, but also pretty well maintained in this time period. Okay, so it's time to start plopping down our first buildings. We want to get that hotel, that row of shops and the taller building behind it, and also let's get that parking row on the curb there. It's a nice little detail, and I think it adds to the realism of it. I think these buildings by Targa are pretty much the best look-alike that I can find for the ones that you see above the shops on this main road in Kaliningrad. And now for the curb parking, I'm using the no controller mod on an asphalt network to embank it slightly, and that creates this sort of rising curb effect. And if you place it just right, it makes a really smooth transition between the road and the pavement. Now, when you try to make a Soviet city in Cities Skylines, one of the first hurdles you'll come up against is the complete lack of any commercial buildings in that style on the Steam Workshop. And while I hope that is something that Chris Brammer will rectify at some point soon, for now, what you can do is use one of the many, many Russian shop signs that are on the workshop and use procedural objects to modify them to whatever size you need them to be and color match them with whatever buildings you can find that are vague, looky-likey buildings on the workshop. What you see me doing here, I'm creating a little awning front for this grocery store, which will be the Universam, as they were called, and still are called to this day. And it's in little details like this that we're going to tell our soft alternate history of Konstantinovsk. What I have in mind is that at the Potsdam Conference of 1945, instead of Prussia being dissolved, as it was in real life, Prussia becomes its own Soviet Socialist Republic, of which Konstantinovsk, named after Konstantin Rokossovsky, the Soviet general, becomes the capital. And that affords it slightly more grandiosity than Kaliningrad actually received as a minor, mainly military city in the USSR. But we're back looking at Google Maps again, because we're going to finally create this little highway exit that leads onto the central square and build the, in reality, unfinished House of the Soviets. Taking another look at the central square from the highway exit here, you can see there's quite a lot of stairs involved, both up to the square and down into an underpass that goes just underneath the arterial road here. So what I've done is I've used a terraforming network to lower the ground, and then I've used these concrete paths that you can find on the workshop to create this underpass. And I've used these particular paths because they are a lot more narrow than the vanilla paths, and they also don't create the sort of terrain issues that the other narrow pedestrian paths that you can find on the workshop do. Now, the central square in Kaliningrad, and so the central square in Konstantinovsk, was the site of the former Königsberg Castle, which was unfortunately completely leveled along with much of the rest of the city during the Second World War. But on that central square, the remains of the foundations are still able to be seen, and I wanted to kind of recreate that sort of scene here using Armesto's Castro props, which kind of provide the nice sort of basis of where the former castle towers once stood. Now, I've used this little dip in the terrain here to create a doorway to what would be the Königsberg Castle dungeons, which would still be intact after the bombing during the Second World War, and could now be a quite literal tourist trap for visitors to Konstantinovsk. On this side of the road, there, in real life, is quite a new building, a sort of cinema complex there. But I wanted to create something a bit grander. Again, this is Konstantinovsk, capital of the Prussian Soviet Socialist Republic, so there would be something quite grand there. And I found this building from Caracas in Venezuela that fit the bill pretty well, and you can kind of Sovietize it a little bit more by placing these sort of more monolithic concrete buildings at the base to act as sort of commercial level. This mosaic that I'm placing down here is actually one of my own creations. I'm using procedural objects to resize it to fit that wall, and little details like that really go a long way to giving your Soviet city the right sort of feel. raised foundation to our Konstantinovsk House of the Soviets here. And the reason for that pertains to why the Kaliningrad House of the Soviets remains unfinished to this day. You see, the foundation area that the Kaliningrad House of the Soviets was built on was the same site as the former Königsberg Castle moat used to be. So it made the ground very marshy and swampy. And it meant that the foundations couldn't hold, and so the project had to be abandoned as of the late 1970s. So in our timeline, that issue has been overcome by the raised foundations that you see there. And now I'm using procedural objects to create that sort of unusual series of squares of grass that you see in the central square of Kaliningrad. And I'm not sure if that's how it was in 1980 in Kaliningrad, but I like the pattern a lot, so that's how it is in 1980s Konstantinovsk. Well, I think we're done for today. That was quite a long first episode, and I certainly don't intend for any future episodes to drag on quite that long. But to be fair, we have covered quite a lot of ground. We've built a map from scratch, and we've polished off one of the more detailed focal points of the city. Next time we're going to focus on bringing this place to life a bit more. I want to see some old Ladas and Volgas driving up and down these big arterial roads here. So we'll be focusing a lot more on the residential areas that surround the central square. I'll be aiming to have the next one out before Christmas and New Year's. But until then, I hope you've enjoyed. Take good care of each other, and see you next time.